If you apply to a granting agency saying, I'd like to repeat this work, you're likely to be told, why repeat this work? We want to advance knowledge. We want new knowledge. The granting agency will support not a mere repetition of what's already well known. Show us something exciting and new, and we might support it.
Even when an experiment is repeated, divergent results don't necessarily mean fraud.
The trouble with replication is if you try to repeat somebody's work and you can't, there's just too many possible explanations. The reagents are a little bit different, or circumstances are a little bit different, and you just can't come to the conclusion that that person made up his results.
Peer review and replication do catch some misconduct. And defenders of the status quo argue that enough is caught to deter most researchers who are tempted to cheat. Yet one recent study has alleged science's quality control mechanisms can't even be counted on to catch simple sloppiness, let alone a clever fraud. This controversial study was made by Ned Fader and Walter Stewart of the National Institutes of Health. Their concern was not outright fraud, but rather lesser forms of misconduct such as sloppiness, cooking, and trimming. They realized information about the research practices of other scientists would be almost impossible to obtain. So they chose to study a group of scientists whose work had already been closely scrutinized. All of the researchers who had co-authored one or more papers with John Darcy. Darcy was an admitted fraud, but his co-authors had been cleared of wrongdoing by 3 independent investigations. The records of these investigations, which included original lab documents, raw data, and testimony from co-workers, provided Fader and Stewart with a unique window through which they could study the routine work habits of 47 reputable scientists.
It was a little bit like looking into their lab notebooks, which is something you normally can't do with a scientist. And we discovered something very interesting. We discovered that these scientists also had been engaged in various practices that they shouldn't have been. Practices that I think most scientists would regard as departing from accepted standards of research. And it wasn't just a few of these 47 who were doing that, lots were.
These practices ranged from deliberate misstatements of fact, where a person would know something or should have known it at the least and say the opposite, to republishing data that they'd already published and disguising the fact, to not investigating allegations of wrongdoing, right down to much more minor things like putting your name on a paper where you hadn't been involved in the science, or publishing a paper that was just loaded with errors in such a way that it looked as if nobody had read the paper carefully. And when we saw the percentages of scientists who'd been involved in at least one of these activities, we were very surprised. It was a full 70%, something we never would have guessed. We came across one particular case where a single error called into question the entire paper, simply by virtue of the type of error it was. There was a human pedigree showing the inheritance of a disease, and it purported to show a 17-year-old male who had the disease, who had 4 children. And the oldest of these children was 9 years old. And if you think about that, that means that at the age of 8, supposedly, this person impregnated the mother of his first child. And, well, that's not biologically impossible necessarily. It's so improbable that you would think the readers, the referees, the editors would have said, what's going on here?
And this was not published in some obscure journal. It was published as the lead article in the New England Journal of Medicine.
Anxious to share this information, they prepared a paper for publication, totally misjudging how disturbing their findings would be to both the subjects of the study and the scientific community. Threats of lawsuits held up publication for 3 years, but didn't stop the paper from becoming one of the most argued about manuscripts of the decade.
It was perfectly clear that there was a lot of emotion connected with the discussion of the subject of misconduct in science. It's not something that scientists consider in a dispassionate sense, the way they're supposed to consider their normal work in the laboratory. I think a lot of the scientists who objected to our work may themselves feel compelled through all sorts of pressures to engage in some of these practices themselves. And of course, it makes them very uncomfortable to discuss this subject publicly.
The one conclusion that scientifically seems hard to argue against is that the quality control system, the referees, especially the referees and the editors who are meant to look at papers for accuracy and completeness, this system just didn't work in all these cases, and that's a very disturbing thing. The other thing that's disturbing is in this particular sample, the percentage of wrongdoing was so high that it calls to mind the question, could this possibly be typical of the rest of biomedical science? And we don't have the answer to that question because you'd have to do a different sort of study. But it raises the question in a very strong and sharp form in a way that's hard to ignore.
Stewart and Fader have done essentially one experiment. And one of the things it clearly showed was that a close reading of scientific papers would disclose some errors that most scientists would be embarrassed about. On the other hand, I think it's also clear that it's not possible to extrapolate from one sample of the co-authors of John Darcy to all of biological science. It's simply an inappropriate extrapolation from one experiment, essentially one piece of data.
We have gotten very few scientists to tell us, you guys are overestimating the problem. We have very few people saying, you know, it's interesting what you're saying, but I've never seen examples of it. We get an enormous number of people who said, I've seen examples of it happening. So I don't think people are skeptical. I mean, actual working benchtop scientists are not skeptical about what we're saying. The sociologists of science, the people who want to turn this into an art form and study it, say, where are the numbers? Where's the data? How do you know that's right? And from a scientific point of view, they're right. You can't pin it down. But the sense I get, or we haven't yet, and we haven't done the study and nobody else has, but the sense I get from our colleagues is they're saying, we've known about this for a long time. We know it's a severe problem. We don't know what to do about it. We don't even know how to talk about it.